Before dawn, the dead tank moves. At 4:17 in the morning on January 18, 1943, near the broken outskirts west of Stalingrad, a German anti-tank crew was watching a dead Soviet tank through frost-clouded field glasses. The tank had been there since the evening before. A T-34, or what was left of one. Its left track had been torn loose. The rear deck was stained black from smoke. One of the hatches hung open at an awkward angle, rocking slightly in the wind whenever the cold moved through the ruins. The Germans had seen it stop. They had seen smoke rise from it. They had watched no crew climb back inside. By the rules of the battlefield, it was finished. Someone had written it down that way. Destroyed. Not damaged. Not delayed. Not uncertain. Destroyed. The German gun crew had done what trained anti-tank men were supposed to do. They had waited until the Soviet armor came close enough. They had fired. They had seen the machine lurch, stop, and go silent. In their minds, and soon in some report behind the line, that tank no longer belonged to tomorrow's battle. But now, in the gray before sunrise, the corpse made a sound. Not a clean sound. Not the steady growl of a healthy engine. It coughed. It knocked. Then it caught for half a second and died again. The German corporal behind the optics lowered them from his eyes. For a moment, he may have thought the cold was playing tricks with distance. Sound carried strangely across frozen ground. Metal cracked in low temperatures. Wrecks settled. Fires hidden inside machines sometimes breathed long after a battle ended. Then the sound came again. This time longer. Somewhere beneath the torn armor, a Soviet mechanic had one hand pressed against freezing steel and the other near a fuel line that should not have worked. His fingers were stiff, blackened with oil, and wrapped in dirty cloth where the skin had split. Another man was near the broken track, hunched low, trying to pull a pin into place while the first pale line of morning touched the snow. They had worked through the night. Not in a workshop. Not under a roof. Not with proper light. They had worked in the open, in darkness broken only by covered lamps, cigarette embers, and the brief blue-white flash of a welding arc hidden under canvas. They had crawled beneath the hull while German artillery still fell somewhere beyond the road. They had stripped parts from another wreck nearby. A road wheel, a length of track, a cable, bolts that did not quite belong but could be made to hold. No one had made the tank new. No one had made it safe. They had made it move. And on the Eastern Front, sometimes that was enough. Inside the German position, the mood changed before anyone said anything. Men understood some things without orders. A moving tank meant range. It meant traverse. It meant a shell might come through the morning fog before they had adjusted their gun. It meant infantry might be behind it. It meant yesterday's work had not removed tomorrow's danger. The T-34 shuddered again. The track bit into the frozen mud. For a few seconds, the whole vehicle seemed to argue with itself. Engine fighting metal, metal fighting ice, ice fighting weight. Then it moved forward, slowly, horribly, as if dragged out of the grave. The Germans had believed a dead tank stayed dead. What really happened was more disturbing. On the Eastern Front, death was sometimes only a repair problem. And the men who understood that were not the generals whose names appeared on maps. They were not the tank aces whose scores were counted. They were the men beneath the armor. Mechanics, recovery crews, welders, drivers, boys with tools in their pockets and smoke in their lungs. Men who did not call it heroism. They called it getting one more tank back before dawn. But to understand why that moment unsettled German soldiers so deeply, we have to begin with a simple question. What did a destroyed tank actually mean? The German meaning of destroyed, to a German anti-tank crew, destruction was supposed to be visible. A tank advanced. A gun fired. The target stopped. Smoke rose. The turret did not turn again. The crew did not return. In the speed and terror of battle, that was often enough. A gunner could not climb across open ground to inspect every vehicle he had hit. A commander could not wait for perfect proof before reporting the results of an engagement. Artillery was falling. Infantry was moving. Radios were overloaded with half-sent messages and shouted corrections. Tanks burned differently. Some exploded. Some only smoked. Some looked dead before they were dead. Others looked intact while everyone inside had been killed. War did not offer clean categories, but armies needed them. A report had to say something. Destroyed, damaged, disabled, abandoned, captured, recovered. Those words looked clear on paper. On a battlefield outside Stalingrad, Kursk, Rzhev, or Kharkov, they could blur into one another within minutes. German doctrine had grown from a deep respect for mobility, precision, and decisive action. In the early years of the war, German armored formations had moved with a tempo that stunned enemies. A tank destroyed on the field was not simply a machine lost. It was proof that the enemy's momentum had been broken. A Soviet armored attack that left wrecks behind could be counted, assessed, and used to measure success. And for a time, this seemed reasonable. German anti-tank weapons were deadly. Experienced crews learned where to aim, how long to wait, when to open fire, and when to shift targets. They knew that a hit to a track could stop a tank even if it did not penetrate the hull. They knew that a vehicle trapped in front of a gun line might be finished by a second shot, by artillery, by infantry, or by fire spreading through the engine compartment. If a Soviet tank stopped in the open, it was vulnerable. If smoke came from it, it was often assumed lost. If the crew abandoned it, it belonged to the battlefield. That belief made sense from the position of the man behind the gun shield. He had seconds to decide. He was cold, deafened, afraid, and trained to read the signs of destruction quickly. But the Eastern Front had a way of turning reasonable beliefs into dangerous habits. A tank with a broken track was not always a dead tank. A tank with a damaged radiator was not always a useless tank. A tank with a burned exterior might still have a working gun, a usable engine, an intact transmission, or armor plates that could be cut away and used elsewhere. A vehicle that could not fight at sunset might still be towed back after dark. A machine abandoned under fire might be entered again by men who knew the battlefield differently from those who had fired at it. German soldiers saw the visible end of a fight. Soviet repair crews saw the beginning of another one. The difference mattered. In German reports, a knocked-out tank became part of a count. It added to a number that suggested enemy strength had been reduced. But if that same tank returned 3 days later, or even the next morning, the number had lied. Not completely. The vehicle had been hit. It had been stopped. It had been defeated in that moment. But it had not been removed from the war. That was the hidden danger. On the Eastern Front, the question was not only how many Soviet tanks the Germans knocked out. It was how many stayed knocked out. The answer was often uncomfortable. German crews sometimes found that wrecks disappeared from the battlefield overnight. A hull that had been sitting near a ridge was gone by morning. A vehicle too damaged to drive had been dragged away by cables. Another had been stripped until only a shell remained. Tracks in the snow or mud showed that men had been there after dark, working under conditions that most soldiers would have considered nearly impossible. At first, this could be dismissed. Crude repairs, desperation, Soviet indifference to quality. A tank dragged from a battlefield and patched together with salvaged parts could not possibly match a properly serviced machine. It might break again. It might fail in motion. It might be dangerous to its crew. All of that was true. But it missed the point. The Soviet field repair system did not need every restored tank to be perfect. It needed enough of them to return at the right time, in the right place, for long enough to matter. A damaged tank that moved another mile could carry infantry. A repaired gun that fired 5 more rounds could force a German crew to duck. A vehicle with stiff steering could still block a road. A tank that broke down again after 1 hour could still make that hour more expensive for the enemy. This was not elegance. It was arithmetic under fire. And the Germans were not wrong to respect destruction. Destruction mattered. A knocked-out tank could mean dead men, wasted fuel, lost momentum, and a gap in the line. But the Soviets were learning to respect something else. Recovery. A battlefield was not only a place where machines died. It was a place where usable steel could be taken back from death before the enemy understood what had happened. That is why the word destroyed became dangerous. It comforted the men who wrote it. It simplified what could not be simplified. And in the dark, While reports moved backward through channels and officers rested their eyes over maps, men with cables and torn gloves were already making that word uncertain. The Germans had believed a tank kill was an ending. What really happened was that, in many cases, it was only a pause, and the Soviet Union, bleeding armor at a terrifying rate, had no choice but to become very good at turning pauses into returns. The Soviet problem nobody could ignore. The Soviet Union did not build its repair culture from comfort. It built it from catastrophe. In 1941, when German armies drove east with a speed that stunned Europe, the Red Army lost men, tanks, roads, depots, workshops, and whole layers of organization. Soviet armored formations were smashed in encirclements, scattered across roads, abandoned for lack of fuel, or destroyed piecemeal in counterattacks ordered faster than units could prepare. Factories were moved east under conditions that belonged more to survival than planning. Machines were unbolted from floors, loaded onto rail cars, and sent beyond the reach of the German advance. Workers traveled with them. Families traveled with them. Sometimes production resumed before roofs had been finished over the factory floor. Tanks came out of industry under pressure that would have broken a more delicate system. But production alone could not solve everything. A tank was not useful because it existed somewhere on a factory tally. It had to reach the front. It needed fuel, ammunition, trained crews, spare parts, recovery vehicles, mechanics, tools, and time. Time was the one thing the Eastern Front almost never gave. The Red Army needed armor everywhere. In the north, around Leningrad, where the war froze into siege and hunger. In the center, near Moscow, where German confidence met winter, exhaustion, and Soviet counterattack. In the south, where open ground swallowed divisions and rivers became lines of blood and mud. And later, at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond, where tank armies would become not just weapons but instruments of operational survival. Every damaged tank presented a question. Could it be saved? Not in theory. Not in a manual. Now, before the Germans came back, before artillery found it, before the ground froze harder around it, before the crew was lost, the parts were stolen, the engine cracked, or the hull burned beyond use. A new tank was valuable. A recovered tank could be just as valuable because it was already near the battle. It already belonged to a unit, could sometimes be returned faster than a replacement could arrive by rail. This was the brutal logic that shaped Soviet repair practice. A tank did not have to be beautiful. It did not have to look as it had looked when it left the factory. The paint could be burned away. The armor could be scarred. The wheels could be mismatched. The engine could cough. The turret could complain when it turned. If it could move and fire, it had a purpose. If it could move without firing, it might still carry men, tow another vehicle, block a road, or draw fire. If it could not move, it might still give up parts. Nothing was ignored until it had been stripped of usefulness. In that world, the battlefield itself became a warehouse. Terrible one. Its shelves were wrecked hulls, broken tracks, cracked road wheels, torn cables, engines full of dirt, and guns twisted by impact. Its floor was mud, snow, burned grass, rubble, and sometimes bodies no one had yet been able to move. The men who entered that warehouse did not do so with the romance of invention. They did it because the alternative was worse. Without repair, the Red Army would have needed to replace every damaged tank from the rear. Without recovery, vehicles lost to minor mechanical damage might become permanent losses. Without salvage, the destruction of one machine would not help another live. German observers often saw Soviet machines as crude. In some cases, compared with more finely finished German vehicles, Soviet tanks did look rougher. Welds could be uneven. Interiors were harsh. Comfort was minimal. Visibility could be poor. The T-34, especially in its earlier forms, was not a perfect machine. But the Germans sometimes misunderstood what that roughness meant. A weapon designed for a war of attrition did not need the same kind of refinement as a weapon designed for a shorter, cleaner campaign imagined by planners. It needed to be produced in vast numbers. It needed to be repaired under awful conditions. It needed to tolerate mud, abuse, cold, poor roads, and crews who had little time to learn. Soviet field repair did not stand apart from that philosophy. It was part of it. The machine and the repairmen belonged to the same war. At the front, repair units lived between the rear and the firing line. They were not always in the first wave of attack, but they were close enough to hear the guns. They moved behind advances, followed retreats, searched the ground after engagements, and made fast decisions about what could be recovered and what had to be abandoned. The work was physical before it was technical. Chains had to be dragged through mud, track sections lifted, hatches forced open, engines reached through awkward spaces, frozen bolts heated, damaged vehicles pulled by tractors, other tanks, or anything powerful enough to move them. Sometimes the repairman's first problem was not the engine. It was getting to the machine without being killed. A disabled tank in no man's land could be watched by German guns. A recovery attempt might draw fire. The wreck might sit in a minefield. Ammunition inside might cook off without warning. A vehicle that seemed safe might contain dead crewmen, sharp metal, spilled fuel, or smoke trapped in the fighting compartment. Still they went, because a tank left in the open was not just a lost machine. It was a gift to the enemy. The Germans could study it, strip it, photograph it, use it as cover, fire at anyone who tried to reach it, or simply count it with confidence. Soviet repair crews worked to deny them that certainty. They moved in darkness. They used smoke, weather, shellfire, and confusion. They waited for gaps. They improvised. They took parts from one wreck to save another and accepted that nothing about the process would be clean. A German report might record Soviet tank losses in heavy numbers. And the losses were real. But behind the numbers was a second movement, quieter and harder to see. Vehicles being dragged backward, repaired at field workshops, cannibalized, patched, and returned. Not always quickly, not always successfully, but often enough to change how strength regenerated after battle. The Soviets did not solve the problem of destruction by pretending it did not exist. They built a system around the fact that destruction was often incomplete. This is what the Germans did not always see. They saw the explosion. They did not see the recovery tractor after midnight. They saw the burning hull. They did not see the mechanic testing whether the starter could be saved. They saw a tank stop. They did not see men asking whether one more hour could be taken from it. And that question, one more hour, would become one of the quietest weapons on the Eastern Front. But first, someone had to crawl beneath the armor. The men beneath the armor. The men who repaired tanks rarely looked like the men on recruiting posters. They were not always clean-shaven young heroes staring toward the horizon. They were often older than the crews they served, or younger than they should have been for the work they carried. Their uniforms were stiff with oil. Their faces were cut by cold. Their sleeves smelled of fuel, smoke, and burned insulation. They worked in places where cameras did not linger. Behind a ruined barn. Beside a road crushed by traffic. Under torn canvas in a frozen orchard. At the edge of a village where half the houses had no roofs and the wind moved through the walls as if through a rib cage. A tank mechanic at the front did not have the luxury of thinking about a machine as an object. A tank was weight, noise, injury, heat, danger, and deadline. It could crush fingers, burn skin, trap men inside, or explode when handled carelessly. Every part was heavy. Every surface was sharp or cold. Every repair began with uncertainty. What was broken? What could be saved? What would fail next? The men beneath the armor learned to read damage like a language. A track thrown by a mine left one kind of evidence. A shell strike left another. A burned engine compartment told a different story from a tank that had been abandoned after running out of fuel. A bent road wheel, a cracked suspension arm, a jammed turret ring, a punctured radiator, a damaged clutch. Each meant a different kind of work and a different chance of success. Commander might ask one question. Can it fight? A mechanic had to ask 10 more. Can it move? Can it steer? Can the gun fire? Will the engine hold? Can the track last 5 kilometers? Will the crew die from fumes before they reach the line? Is the ammunition safe? Can we tow it? Can we strip it? Is it worth the men we may lose trying? This was not glamorous judgment. It was tired judgment, made under shellfire and sleep deprivation. There is a certain kind of courage that does not announce itself. It has no flag. It does not charge. It does not shout. It lies on its back beneath 30 tons of damaged steel while snow falls into its collar and someone says the artillery is getting closer. That was the courage of the repair crews. They were not always treated as warriors in memory, but the battlefield did not care about memory. Cared whether machines returned. Sometimes the mechanics worked with tank crews who had survived the hit. Those meetings could be quiet. A driver might stand nearby, ashamed or angry, watching another man inspect the vehicle he had almost died inside. A gunner might point with a bandaged hand to where the turret had jammed. A commander might demand too much because he knew his unit had too little. Other times the crew was gone. Then the repairmen had to enter the machine. There were no clean ways to do this. A knocked-out tank could hold the last moments of the men who had fought inside it. Smoke, blood, torn maps, spent shell casings, a helmet, a photograph, a glove stuck beneath a lever. The smell inside a burned armored vehicle was something men remembered even when they did not speak of it. A repairman did not have time to mourn properly. He had to find out whether the gun still worked. This is why the story of Soviet field repairs cannot be told only through machines. The machines did not return by themselves. They returned because men learned to work in the narrow space between death and usefulness. They salvaged not only steel but possibility. A T-34's design helped them. Its broad tracks, diesel engine, sloped armor, and comparatively straightforward construction made it suited to a war of harsh conditions. But no design repairs itself. No tank crawls out of mud because a manual says it can. Someone has to attach the cable. Someone has to swing the hammer. Someone has to decide that a part from one wreck can keep another alive. German soldiers sometimes mocked these repairs because they looked crude. A plate welded roughly over damage. A mismatched wheel. A tank moving with a sound that suggested it might break apart. These were easy things to dismiss from a distance. But the men doing the mocking were not the ones lying under the hull in the dark. They were not the ones making a temporary fix hold long enough for an attack. They were not the ones turning ruined machines into a kind of battlefield reserve. The repairmen saw what others missed because their relationship with the tank was more intimate than admiration or fear. They knew its weaknesses. They knew where it leaked, where it cracked, where it could be forced, and where it could not. They also understood something officers sometimes forgot. A tank was not either alive or dead. It existed on a scale. Fully operational. Damaged but moving. Moving but unable to fight. Unable to move but useful for parts. Burned but still worth stripping. Gone only when nothing remained that could serve. That way of thinking changed everything. It meant a battlefield covered in wrecks was not simply evidence of defeat. It was a field of choices. A terrible, dangerous field, but not an empty one. A German officer looking through binoculars might see 5 Soviet tanks knocked out. A Soviet repair officer might see 1 reparable hull, 2 useful engines, 3 sets of track links, several road wheels, a gun sight, and enough armor plate to patch another vehicle before morning. One side saw finality. The other saw inventory. And once that inventory was understood, the next step was inevitable. The battlefield itself would become a parts yard. The battlefield becomes a parts yard. After an armored clash, the ground did not look like a workshop. It looked like the end of things. Burned tanks sat at odd angles, half sunk into mud or snow. Turrets pointed nowhere. Tracks lay twisted beside craters. Road wheels were broken loose and scattered like dark coins across the field. Empty shell cases glinted in the dirt. Smoke rose from places where fuel had burned down to a low, greasy smolder. Men moved carefully there. Not because the battle was over, but because the battlefield after a battle could kill as efficiently as the battle itself. Mines remained. Artillery might return. German observers could still be watching. Ammunition inside wrecks could explode if heated or struck. A vehicle might be sitting in a patch of ground already registered by enemy guns. And sometimes the dead were still close enough to be seen clearly. This was where Soviet repair and recovery crews began their second battle. They did not approach the wreckage as mourners, Not at first. They approached it as men with a list in their heads. Track links, road wheels, torsion bars, fuel pumps, tow cables, machine guns, gun sights, hatches, batteries, starter motors, armor plate, anything that could be unbolted, cut loose, dragged away, carried, welded, hammered, or forced into another machine. A destroyed tank rarely died completely at once. A shell might kill the crew but leave the engine. A mine might tear off a track but spare the gun. A fire might ruin the fighting compartment but leave road wheels usable. A tank sunk in mud might be impossible to recover quickly, but its external parts could still be stripped. The field became a warehouse because the Red Army could not afford to see it only as a graveyard. There was a grim intelligence in the way mechanics moved through it. They knew which tanks to ignore. Some were too dangerous. Some were too exposed. Some had burned too hot. Some could not be reached before daylight. Some would cost more to recover than they could return. Others were different. A machine with its track off and engine intact might be worth a night's labor. A tank hit in the turret might still have a lower hull that could serve. A vehicle with a dead engine might donate parts to one with a working one. In the language of repair, one tank's failure could become another tank's reprieve. This was cannibalization. The word is ugly because the work was ugly. For broken machines might become one fighting machine. 3 wrecks might give up enough parts to move 2 more. A tank that would never fire again might still allow another to cross a field at dawn. German soldiers sometimes interpreted this as proof of Soviet crudity. They saw rough welding, mixed components, improvised patches, and vehicles returned to service in visibly damaged condition. To a military culture that prized order, records, and mechanical quality, these repairs could look almost careless. But crude is not the same as stupid. Temporary is not the same as useless. A field repair did not need to satisfy a factory inspector. It needed to satisfy the next hour of war. The next hour might be all that mattered. Imagine a Soviet mechanic kneeling in the snow beside a disabled T-34. He knows the replacement part does not match perfectly. He knows the wheel came from another tank damaged in a different way. He knows the bolts are worn. He knows the track may not hold under long movement. But the infantry is waiting. The commander wants the road blocked. German guns are expected to open before daylight. There is no second part, no second night, no proper shop. He can refuse because the repair is imperfect. Or he can make imperfection move. That was the kind of decision that rarely appears in grand histories of campaigns. It does not have the clean shape of a battle plan. It belongs to cold fingers, tired eyes, and the sound of metal struck quietly under blackout conditions. At night, recovery teams sometimes worked by touch as much as sight. Lamps were covered. Voices stayed low. Tools were wrapped or handled carefully to reduce noise. A hammer blow could carry in still air. An engine test could announce everything. A cable laid across the ground became a lifeline. If attached properly, a tractor or another tank could drag a disabled vehicle out of danger. If attached poorly, it could snap, whip back, injure men, or waste the few minutes before enemy fire returned. The work had rhythm. Hook the cable. Check the ground. Clear the track. Pull. Stop. Dig. Pull again. Listen. Freeze when a flare rises. Move when darkness returns. There was nothing cinematic for the men doing it. No music. No clean arc. Just breath in cold air, the scrape of steel, and the knowledge that daylight was coming whether they were finished or not. The battlefield punished delay. If a damaged tank was not recovered quickly, the enemy might destroy it completely. A second hit, a demolition charge, artillery, or fire could turn a reparable vehicle into scrap. Weather could make recovery harder. Mud could swallow it deeper. Snow could cover hazards. The front could move and leave it behind. So the Soviets developed urgency not as a slogan but as a habit. Every wreck had a clock attached to it. The Germans saw a tank stop and thought the clock had ended. The repair crews knew another clock had begun. And the most unsettling part for the enemy was not that every tank returned. Most did not. War was too destructive for that. Many machines burned beyond saving. Many crews died. Many vehicles were abandoned for good. The unsettling part was that enough returned. Enough to make German reports less certain. Enough to force anti-tank crews to fight machines they believed had already been removed. Enough to turn wreckage into a kind of delayed resistance. And once the repairmen understood what could be salvaged, commanders began to accept a harsher idea. A tank did not have to be properly repaired to be useful. It only had to be good enough to fight. That idea was dangerous. It was also unavoidable. Good enough to fight. There are machines that return from repair with confidence. Cleaned, tested, adjusted, declared ready. Then there are machines that return because no one has the time to ask for confidence. A Soviet tank pulled from a battlefield at night might arrive at a field workshop half-frozen, half-burned, and dragging its damage behind it. Men would gather around it and begin the argument every army knows but few write honestly into reports. How much repair is enough? A factory answer would be different from a frontline answer. A factory could insist on proper alignment, correct parts, full inspection, clean tolerances, safe operation. A frontline unit near Stalingrad or Kursk might ask only whether the vehicle could move before the German attack began. This was not because Soviet commanders did not care about crews. It was because the war often made caring complicated. A tank kept too long in repair might be safe for the men inside it and useless to the men waiting for it. A tank sent forward too soon might help stop an attack and kill its crew when the engine failed under fire. There was no moral purity in the choice. Only risk divided in different directions. The phrase good enough can sound careless from a distance. At the front, it was a calculation made with lives. A tank with rough steering could still move down a road. A tank with a damaged radio could still follow another vehicle. A tank with a slow turret could still fire if positioned carefully. A tank with mismatched wheels could still cross open ground. A tank whose engine might fail after an hour could still make that hour count. That was the core of the Soviet field repair mentality at its hardest edge. Not perfection, function. Not elegance. Return. To German observers, such machines looked like evidence of weakness. They saw armor patched with crude welds, engines smoking, vehicles moving unevenly, crews fighting from machines that seemed barely serviceable. It was tempting to laugh. It was tempting to believe that such tanks could not matter against better gunnery, better optics, better technical discipline. But battle has never rewarded contempt for long. A badly repaired tank could still absorb a shell meant for infantry, could still force a gun crew to reveal its position, could still drive into a street and block it, could still carry men through machine gun fire, could still fire high explosive into a building, could still make an enemy commander hesitate. Sometimes hesitation was enough. The Germans had built much of their battlefield success on speed of decision, movement, and shock. But shock can work in more than one direction. There is a particular kind of shock in seeing something return after you have mentally removed it from the battlefield. A tank believed dead but moving again does not need to be invincible. It only needs to disturb the enemy's sense of order. Inside Soviet units, these decisions were often made under brutal pressure. A battalion commander might be told he needed 5 tanks for a counterattack and find that only 3 were fully operational. Behind him, repairmen were trying to force 2 more into something like readiness. The commander knew what he wanted. The mechanics knew what they could honestly promise. Between those 2 things lay the truth. Will it move? Yes. How far? A pause. Far enough, maybe. No speech. No grand declaration. Just the kind of answer men give when they know certainty has left the war. The crew assigned to such a tank understood the risk. They could hear the engine. They could feel the steering. They knew when a vehicle did not sound right. Tank crews lived by small signals. Vibration through the floor, smell of fuel, delay in turret movement, the way the clutch responded, the sound of track links under strain. A machine can frighten its own crew before the enemy ever sees it. Yet men climbed in, not because they were fearless, because everyone else was also afraid. The infantry waiting behind them feared crossing open ground without armor. The commander feared the German attack breaking through. The mechanics feared the machine failing and their repair becoming a death sentence. The driver feared losing control under fire. The gunner feared the turret jamming at the wrong second. War collected these fears and called the result an operation. The repaired tank became a compromise made of steel. It carried the labor of the men who patched it, the anxiety of the crew who entered it, and the expectation of the soldiers who would follow it. If it failed too early, men would die. If it worked long enough, men might live. This is why the story of Soviet field repairs cannot be reduced to clever improvisation. It was not only clever, it was merciless. It asked men to trust temporary fixes in permanent danger. But it also answered a real battlefield need. The Red Army could not always wait for ideal conditions. The Eastern Front was too large, too violent, too hungry for machines. German attacks did not pause until workshops were ready. Defensive lines did not hold because paperwork was complete. A damaged tank in motion could be more useful than a perfect tank still hundreds of kilometers away. This was the hard lesson. A weapon's value was not measured only by its condition. It was measured by what it could still do. And sometimes what it could still do was simple. Move forward. Draw fire. Fire once. Block the road. Carry infantry. Survive one more hour. That hour might allow reserves to arrive. It might cover a withdrawal. It might break the timing of an attack. It might force the enemy to deploy early, reveal guns, waste ammunition, or slow down long enough for artillery to find them. 1 hour. That was all some repaired tanks were asked to give. The German army had believed such machines were evidence of Soviet desperation. What really happened was that desperation became a method. And methods, once tested under fire, have a way of becoming doctrine without anyone formally naming them. The test would come before sunrise, when the repaired machine left the hands of the mechanics and entered the vision slit of the enemy gunner. The test under fire. The first sound was not the gun. It was the engine, a rough, uneven growl moving through the dark like something wounded but not finished. The tank shook when it started, coughed smoke from the rear, and sat for a moment as if uncertain whether it would obey the men inside it. The driver waited with both hands tight on the controls. He could feel the repair through the machine, not as an idea, as vibration, as resistance, as small delays between what he asked the tank to do and what the tank agreed to do. The left track had been replaced from another vehicle. The road wheel was not the one the tank had gone into battle with. Somewhere behind him, the engine note rose and fell in a way that made every man listen. Outside, the mechanics stepped back. They did not celebrate. They watched. A repaired tank was not proven in the workshop. It was proven when weight shifted, track links tightened, and the vehicle moved under its own power. Even then, nothing was certain. A repair could hold for 1 kilometer and fail on the second. A bolt could shear. A track could slip. A fuel line could leak. A gun could jam. A turret could refuse to traverse when it mattered. But the infantry was already gathering behind it. Men crouched in the cold, rifles held close, faces hidden beneath helmets and scarves. They were not thinking about maintenance. They were thinking about the open ground ahead. A tank, even a damaged one, changed the way fear felt. It gave them something large to follow. Something that might take the first burst of machine gun fire. Something that might make the enemy aim at steel before flesh. The commander inside the tank looked through limited vision into darkness and smoke. He did not see a grand battlefield. He saw fragments. A wall. A crater. A dead horse frozen near a cart. A telegraph pole leaning over the road. Shapes that might be rubble or men. The radio, if it worked at all, offered only broken sound. Static. A clipped command. Someone breathing too close to a microphone. Then silence again. The tank moved. Slowly at first. The repaired track clattered louder than it should have. Metal struck metal in uneven rhythm. Each turn carried the threat of failure. The driver avoided sharp movement where he could, but battle does not arrange itself for damaged machines. The ground ahead was rutted, frozen, torn by shellfire, and littered with debris. Behind them, one of the mechanics watched the track. He knew it would not last forever. He did not know whether it would last long enough. The Germans heard it before they saw it. For an anti-tank crew, engine sound was information. Men learned to distinguish movement in the dark. Trucks, half-tracks, tanks, tractors, distant traffic, friendly vehicles, enemy armor. In the cold air before dawn, sound could travel in strange ways, but this sound had weight. The German gun commander turned his head. The tank they had hit the evening before was supposed to be finished. Yet something was moving from that direction. The first flare went up. For a few seconds, the battlefield became a harsh white photograph. Ruins, snow, smoke, men caught in positions they wished darkness still hid. And there it was, the T-34. Not clean, not whole, not fast, but moving. The German crew reacted with the discipline of men who knew their work. They began to traverse the gun. Someone shouted range. Someone else handled a shell with hands made clumsy by cold. The loader forced it into the breech. The gunner leaned into the sight. But the moment had already changed. The Germans were not firing at an expected target in an expected condition. They were firing at a contradiction. A tank counted dead had returned to the fight. And behind it, Soviet infantry moved. This was the true danger of the repaired tank. Not that it was better than a fresh German vehicle. It was not. Not that it could survive anything. Could not. The danger was that it arrived when the enemy had already removed it from the equation. A gun position that expected infantry might now have to fire at armor. A crew that expected a quiet sector might reveal itself. A commander who believed Soviet strength had been reduced might find the pressure returning before reports had adjusted. The German gun fired. The first shot struck short, throwing earth and snow against the tank's lower hull. The driver flinched but kept moving. The infantry behind the vehicle dropped flat. Someone shouted, but the engine swallowed the words. Inside the tank, the commander ordered a correction. The turret turned slowly, too slowly. The gunner waited for the sight picture to settle. The loader moved in the cramped space with the practiced economy of men who knew there was no room for panic. The second German shot came closer. A metallic crack rang across the hull. A hit or a near hit inside it hardly mattered. The sound filled the tank like a bell. Dust and frost shook loose. For a moment no one spoke. Then the Soviet gun fired. The recoil slammed through the damaged machine. The shell did not need to destroy the German gun. It needed to make its crew duck, shift, hesitate, lose rhythm. It needed to give the infantry a few seconds. It needed to keep the fight from unfolding cleanly. Another shell was loaded. The tank moved again. Every meter was an argument. The repaired track held. The engine held. The gun fired again. For the men who had patched the machine in darkness, those seconds were everything. Their work was no longer a repair. It was a presence on the battlefield. A thing the enemy had to answer. That was the test under fire. Not whether the tank was perfect. Whether it could force the enemy to deal with it. And by that standard, the dead tank had already returned. But one returned tank was a shock. Pattern was something worse. As German units continued to face Soviet armor across the Eastern Front, they began to notice that the battlefield did not stay the way they left it. Wrecks disappeared. Damaged machines came back. And slowly, the meaning of a tank kill began to feel less final than it once had. The moment the Germans realized. Realization in war does not always arrive as a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it comes as irritation. A report that does not match what the men at the front are seeing. A sector believed weakened that remains stubborn. A Soviet formation thought badly damaged that attacks again sooner than expected. A wrecked tank that is gone when patrols return. At first, each event can be explained. The Germans had misidentified the vehicle. The tank was not as badly damaged as believed. The Soviets had brought up replacements. The report was incomplete. The night concealed movement. All of these explanations could be true in individual cases. But war teaches through repetition. Again and again, German troops saw that Soviet armored losses did not always produce the expected collapse in pressure. Vehicles knocked out in one engagement did not always vanish from the war. The Red Army, despite terrible losses, kept generating armor at the front with a speed that was difficult to reconcile with German expectations. Part of that was production. The Soviet Union built tanks in numbers Germany could not comfortably match, especially as the war continued. But production is only part of the story. The other part was recovery. A tank saved near the front did not have to travel from a distant factory. It did not require the same logistical chain as a new replacement. It was already in the theater of war. It could be repaired, redistributed, or stripped. Even when it never returned as a complete vehicle, it might help several others return. The Germans were not blind to this. German forces conducted their own recovery and repair operations, and German mechanics were highly skilled. But the Soviet scale, urgency, and tolerance for rough operational restoration created a different kind of resilience. It was not pretty. It was not always efficient in the way a peacetime engineer would admire. But it was persistent. And persistence has a psychological effect. Imagine being a German anti-tank gunner after several weeks of this. You fire at Soviet armor. You score hits. You watch vehicles stop. You survive the engagement. You hear officers say the attack has been repulsed. You may even feel relief. Then, days later, sometimes sooner, more Soviet tanks appear. Some are new. Some are scarred in familiar ways. Some move with damage visible even from a distance. You begin to wonder how much of your work stays done. That doubt matters. Soldiers can endure danger. They can endure exhaustion. What corrodes them slowly is the sense that effort does not produce final results. The German army had invaded the Soviet Union with assumptions about speed, collapse, encirclement, and decisive destruction. By 1942 and 1943, many of those assumptions had been damaged. Not only by Soviet resistance, winter, distance, and production, but by the stubborn material fact that Soviet forces could absorb punishment and still regenerate fighting power. Field repair was one small but important part of that larger reality. The battlefield did not remain fixed after the guns stopped. Soviet crews moved through it. They recovered. They stripped. They patched. They returned. A German officer might look at a map and believe his units had reduced Soviet armor in a sector by a certain number. But the ground itself was working against that certainty. Behind the Soviet lines, damaged vehicles were entering repair cycles. Salvaged parts were moving. Mechanics were making decisions too small for maps and too important to ignore. What the Germans believed was that destruction would simplify the battlefield. What really happened was that Soviet repair made the battlefield more difficult to read. A knocked-out tank no longer meant one thing. It might mean a total loss. It might mean a vehicle returning next week. It might mean parts for 3 other tanks. It might mean a weapon that would fight badly briefly, but at exactly the wrong moment for the enemy. This uncertainty widened the gap between tactical success and operational result. A German gun crew could perform perfectly and still not produce the larger outcome expected. A Soviet tank could be defeated in one place and still contribute to resistance elsewhere. The relationship between killing a machine and weakening an army became less direct. That was the deeper reversal. The Germans did not suddenly fear every repaired Soviet tank as an unstoppable weapon. That would be false. Many repaired vehicles failed. Many were destroyed again. Many never returned. German weapons remained deadly, and German crews remained dangerous. The shock was more subtle and more corrosive. The Soviets had made destruction inefficient. They forced the enemy to spend effort twice, sometimes 3 times. A tank had to be hit, then confirmed, then denied recovery, then perhaps hit again after it returned. In a war of attrition, making the enemy repeat work was a form of strength. And this strength did not come from a miracle weapon. It came from men with cables, spanners, torches, tractors, and a refusal to treat every wreck as final. By 1943, the German army was fighting not only Soviet tanks, but Soviet recovery capacity, Soviet industry, Soviet manpower, Soviet tolerance for loss, and Soviet improvisation under pressure. The tank on the battlefield was the visible point of a larger system. The Germans had mocked the roughness. They had underestimated the system. The moment of realization was not one tank moving at dawn. It was the recognition that the dawn might keep bringing them back. And behind that recognition lay a cold mathematics. Not the mathematics of engineering perfection. The mathematics of survival. The mathematics of survival. A tank is easy to count when it is new. One vehicle leaves the factory. One vehicle joins a unit. One vehicle appears in a strength report. But once battle begins, the counting becomes less honest. A tank may be operational at dawn, disabled by noon, recovered by night, under repair the next day, stripped for parts the day after, and represented differently in several reports depending on who is writing and what they need to know. War turns machines into moving categories. The Soviets understood this not as a theory, but as a daily necessity. The important question was not simply, how many tanks do we have? It was, how many can move today? How many can fire? How many can be made to move by morning? How many can be stripped before the Germans reach them? How many parts can be saved from machines that will never fight again? The mathematics of survival was built from these questions. Take one damaged tank with a broken track. If abandoned, it is a loss. If recovered, it may return to battle. If repair is impossible, its track links, wheels, gun components, optics, tools, or engine parts may help another vehicle. The same object can be defeat, delay, or supply. The difference is recovery. A single road wheel does not sound dramatic. Neither does a tow cable, a fuel pump, or a length of track. But war is often decided by undramatic objects arriving before dramatic moments. A tank attack may fail because 3 vehicles cannot move. An infantry assault may stall because no armor arrives. A defensive line may break because a road remains open. A counterattack may succeed because one damaged tank was made serviceable just before dawn. This is where the numbers become human. A repaired tank does not need to destroy 10 enemy guns to matter. It may need only to appear. If it appears, German gunners must aim. If they aim, they may reveal themselves. If they reveal themselves, Soviet artillery or infantry may respond. If they respond, the attack changes shape. What looks like one repaired machine can become several consequences. The cost may be small compared with the effect. A salvaged part that returns a vehicle to movement saves the time, transport, and industrial effort of replacing the entire tank. A temporary repair that lasts an hour may be worth the risk if that hour delays an enemy attack. A damaged tank used as a mobile shield may protect infantry long enough to cross open ground. The value lies not in elegance but in timing. Armies often speak of strength in totals. Divisions, tanks, guns, aircraft. But the front line experiences strength in moments. Is there armor here when the enemy attacks? Is there a gun covering the road? Is there something large enough to draw fire away from men on foot? A repaired tank answered those questions imperfectly. But imperfect answers can still save lives. The Germans, too, understood repair and recovery. Their armored forces relied on skilled maintenance, and German workshops could perform sophisticated repairs when parts and conditions allowed. But the German system increasingly suffered under distance, fuel shortage, Allied bombing, spare parts limitations, and the complexity of its own vehicles. A heavily engineered machine could be formidable when functioning. It could also become a burden when recovery conditions were poor. The Soviet approach accepted roughness as part of the battlefield. Simpler construction, mass production, interchangeability where possible, and tolerance for field improvisation created a repair culture suited to a brutal war of distance and attrition. This did not make Soviet tanks invincible. It made them harder to remove permanently. That distinction matters. A weapon does not have to be superior in every duel to be strategically effective. It has to fit the war being fought. The Eastern Front demanded machines and men that could endure loss, mud, winter, overwork, crude conditions, and rapid restoration. The T-34 became famous for many reasons. Armor slope, mobility, diesel engine, production scale, shock effect. But one of its less glamorous strengths was the way it could belong to a system that valued repair under pressure. A tank too refined for field abuse may look impressive in inspection. A tank that can be patched in mud may return when needed. The mathematics was cruel but clear. If a destroyed tank can donate parts, it is not entirely destroyed. If a disabled tank can be recovered, it is not permanently lost. If a repaired tank can fight for 1 hour, that hour enters the battle. And if the enemy must destroy the same machine twice, the enemy's first success has been reduced. Not erased. Reduced. This was the Soviet achievement. Not magic, not mythology, but reduction. They reduced the finality of German firepower. They reduced the meaning of a single hit. They reduced the enemy's ability to translate tactical kills into operational certainty. A German shell could still kill a crew, could still burn a tank, could still stop an attack. But if the machine was not consumed completely, if the ground could be retaken, if the night allowed movement, if mechanics reached it in time, then the shell had not necessarily written the last sentence. That is what made Soviet field repairs so disturbing. They changed the afterlife of battlefield damage. Yet every number in this arithmetic had a human cost. The restored tank was not an abstract asset. It carried men inside it. It carried the risk of failed repair, jammed mechanisms, smoke inhalation, fire, and breakdown under enemy guns. And the mechanics who made the calculation possible paid their own price before the tank ever returned to combat. The mathematics of survival never came free. Someone always paid the remainder. The cost of making steel live again. To say that Soviet field repairs saved tanks is true. It is also incomplete. They saved some men. They endangered others. They allowed attacks to continue, defenses to harden, and formations to regenerate. They also sent crews back into vehicles that any careful engineer might have wanted to keep in the rear for longer inspection. War often turns necessity into virtue after the fact. At the time, it feels less clean. A crew assigned to a repaired tank knew when the machine was not right. The driver could feel stiffness in the controls. The commander could hear the engine's uneven note. The gunner might notice the turret's hesitation. The loader might smell fuel or smoke that should not be there. Inside a tank, small mechanical doubts become personal. There is nowhere to step away. The walls are armor. The air is oil, metal, sweat, and explosive residue. Sound does not enter gently. It slams. Shell impacts ring through the hull. The engine fills the body. Orders arrive broken, shouted, or not at all. A repaired tank could feel like a promise made by someone else. The crew had to live inside it. The mechanics understood that. Many had worked closely enough with crews to know faces, voices, habits. They knew the man who complained about steering, the young driver who smoked too much, the commander who checked the same latch twice, the gunner who said little and noticed everything. When a mechanic tightened a part that he knew was worn, he was not making an abstract compromise. He was handing risk to men he could see. That is a heavy thing. There were also risks for the repair crews themselves. Recovery work could be as dangerous as combat, only less remembered. A disabled tank often sat where enemy guns already knew the range. Trying to retrieve it could bring artillery. German infantry might fire on recovery teams. Mines could detonate under men working around tracks. Ammunition inside damaged vehicles might explode without warning. A tank that had stopped fighting could still kill. Men crawled into vehicles where shells had penetrated, where hot metal had torn through compartments, where smoke had settled in layers. They worked around unexploded rounds, fuel leaks, burned wiring, and structural damage that could shift under weight. A careless spark could be fatal. A cable under tension could snap. A recovery tractor could bog down and trap everyone in the open. The battlefield did not distinguish between the man firing a gun and the man holding a wrench. Both were targets if they were seen. This is why the image of field repair should not be softened too much. It was not simply ingenuity. It was labor performed in the presence of death. The Soviet state celebrated production, sacrifice, and victory. It had reason to. The factories mattered. The tank crews mattered. The commanders, infantry, artillerymen, medics, railway workers, and women in industrial plants mattered. But somewhere between these large categories were the men who took broken machines and made them useful again. They often left fewer traces in popular memory. A tank with a name might be remembered. The men who replaced its track under shellfire might not. And yet without them, many famous armored actions would have been thinner, weaker, slower, or impossible. The cost also extended beyond death and injury. There was exhaustion. Repair work did not respect sleep. Battles ended at irregular hours. Recovery had to happen when darkness, weather, or tactical conditions allowed. Mechanics might work through the night, then move again, then repair another vehicle, then strip a wreck, then take cover, then start over. Cold made tools harder to use. Mud stole time. Snow concealed damage. Summer dust entered engines and lungs. Rain turned repair sites into pits. In winter, bare fingers on metal could tear skin. In deep cold, oil thickened, engines resisted, and simple tasks became slow battles against temperature. A man could become too tired to think clearly, and unclear thinking around damaged armor could kill him. Still, the work continued, because everyone at the front was tired. The infantry was tired. The tank crews were tired. The artillerymen were tired. The doctors were tired. The horses, where they were still used, were tired. The entire war seemed to move on exhaustion, and field repair was one of the places where that exhaustion became visible in human hands. There were moral tensions too. A commander desperate for armor might pressure repair crews to release vehicles early. A mechanic might know a repair was temporary. A crew might be told to take a tank because no other machine was available. No one in that chain had a clean position. The commander needed armor to protect men. The mechanic needed more time to protect the crew. The crew needed a machine that worked. The battlefield gave none of them enough. In such conditions, heroism and cruelty could occupy the same decision. A half-repaired tank sent forward might help save a unit. It might also become a coffin. To understand Soviet field repair honestly, we have to hold both truths together. It was effective. It was costly. It showed human skill under pressure. It also showed how war consumes skill, turning every act of competence into another demand for sacrifice. A repaired tank moving before dawn is an impressive sight from a distance. It suggests resilience, defiance, even resurrection. Up close, it is more complicated. There is a driver listening for failure. Commander trying not to show fear. A mechanic watching the track he repaired, knowing that if it breaks, men may die. An infantryman walking behind the tank because he has no better cover. A German gunner ahead, cold and afraid, preparing to fire because survival has made him efficient. No one in this scene is outside the war's machinery. Everyone is inside it. The Germans had believed Soviet field repairs were crude signs of desperation. What really happened was that desperation produced a system strong enough to disturb German assumptions, and harsh enough to spend men in the process. The tanks returned, but not all the men did. And when the war later told its stories, the machines often stood in the foreground while the repair crews remained in shadow. Recognition came late, when it came at all. Recognition came late if it came at all. Armies remember what they are trained to see. They remember battles, commanders, flags, destroyed enemy vehicles, cities taken, lines held. They remember tanks in motion more easily than tanks being repaired. A tank attack has shape. It moves across a map, can be filmed, painted, narrated, and turned into symbol. A repair crew at night has no clean shape. Men under a hull do not look like history being made. They look like labor, but labor held the war together. In Soviet accounts, the repair system appears often in numbers, reports, and technical references. Vehicles restored, parts salvaged, workshops moved, repair units attached, damage categories processed. These records matter. They show organization, scale, and effectiveness. But numbers can hide the human texture of the work. A report may say that a certain number of tanks were returned to service after repair. It may not say that the men worked under shellfire, or that one vehicle still smelled of the crew who died in it, or that a mechanic used parts from a machine belonging to men he had known. The official language of war is designed to move information upward. It is not designed to preserve the trembling of hands. The Soviet Union did recognize technical labor in many forms. Factory workers were praised. Engineers were honored. Repair units could receive commendations. Individuals could be decorated. But popular memory, especially outside specialist histories, often simplified armored war into tank versus tank, general versus general, front line versus front line. The mechanic became part of the background. That background was decisive. German reports, in their own way, also acknowledged Soviet recovery indirectly. Frustration can be a form of recognition. When an enemy keeps appearing despite heavy losses, officers begin looking for explanations. Soviet industry was one. Reserves were another. Repair and recovery were part of the answer. The Germans came to understand that Soviet armored strength could not be judged only by what was knocked out in front of them. They had to consider what might return, what might be replaced, what might be salvaged, and how quickly damaged formations could regain enough strength to matter. This was a different kind of respect. Not admiration spoken aloud. Not praise. A practical adjustment forced by reality. The battlefield had taught them that Soviet resilience was not only emotional or political. It was mechanical, logistical, and human. It lived in repair crews. It lived in recovery tractors. It lived in railheads and mobile workshops. It lived in men who could look at 3 ruined tanks and imagine one moving vehicle. That ability changed how loss functioned. And because it changed loss, it changed the war. Not alone. Field repair did not win the Eastern Front by itself. No honest documentary should claim that. The defeat of Germany in the East came from many forces. Soviet manpower, industrial relocation, strategic depth, Allied aid, German overreach, weather, command decisions, artillery, logistics, courage, coercion, sacrifice, and mistakes on a scale difficult to comprehend. But within that vast machinery, repair mattered. It made Soviet armor harder to exhaust. It reduced permanent losses. It returned pressure to sectors where the Germans expected relief. It allowed commanders to think in terms of damaged strength rather than vanished strength. And it gave ordinary men a way to influence events far beyond their rank. A mechanic who saved one tank might not change a campaign. But one saved tank could help save a platoon. 10 saved tanks could change a local engagement. Hundreds restored over time could alter the rhythm of armored warfare. The impact did not require legend. It required accumulation. This is often how hidden history works. Not through one spectacular act, but through repeated acts that seem too small to carry a story until someone adds them together. A road wheel removed in the dark. A track replaced before dawn. An engine coaxed back to life. A gun made to fire one more time. A disabled vehicle dragged from a field before the Germans could destroy it completely. Each act looked local. Together, they formed resilience. The men who did this work did not need to think of themselves as changing history. Most likely, many were too tired to think in such terms. They thought about the next repair, the next vehicle, the next command, the next shelling, the next cup of something hot if luck allowed it. History often grows from people who are not thinking about history. They are thinking about the wrench in their hand. That is why recognition can feel inadequate. A medal, a line in a report, a statistic, a photograph beside a damaged tank. These things cannot fully hold the work. They cannot restore the hours, the cold, the fear, the bodies, the machines that failed anyway, or the crews who drove away and did not return. But the lack of recognition does not mean the work was small. Sometimes the least visible labor is visible only in what did not happen. A breakthrough delayed. A road held. An infantry attack supported. A German assumption broken. A tank that should have remained silent moving again before dawn. The Germans had believed that rough Soviet repairs showed weakness. What really happened was that roughness helped conceal strength. Not the strength of perfection. The strength of return. And that legacy reaches beyond the T-34, beyond Stalingrad, beyond the Eastern Front. It speaks to something armies continue to learn in every modern war. A weapon is only as powerful as the system that keeps it alive after damage. Machines win attention. Maintenance wins duration. And duration, on the Eastern Front, became one of the Red Army's most punishing arguments. That argument began in darkness, with damaged steel and men who refused to leave it there. So we returned to the dawn, to the German gun crew, to the sound they thought they would never hear again. What really happened before dawn? The engine was still rough. That matters. The tank that moved before dawn was not reborn as a perfect machine. It did not roll forward like something untouched by war. It dragged its history with it. Every sound it made betrayed the night behind it. The broken track, the salvaged parts, the forced bolts, the hands that worked too long in the cold. It moved unevenly. It smoked. It might fail. But it moved. For the German anti-tank crew watching through the morning haze, that was enough to change the meaning of the battlefield. Yesterday, the tank had been a result. Today, it was a threat. That reversal was the story. Not because one repaired T-34 was invincible. It was not. German guns could kill it again. Mines could tear it open. Mechanical failure could stop it without any enemy help. The men inside it remained vulnerable to fire, smoke, steel fragments, panic, and chance. But the tank's return proved something larger than its own survival. It proved that German assumptions about destruction were incomplete. They had believed a tank stopped in smoke was a finished fact. But what really happened was that the Soviets built an entire battlefield habit around unfinished facts. A wreck could become parts. A damaged machine could become a temporary weapon. A temporary weapon could buy an hour. An hour could hold a road. A road could keep a unit alive. The chain was fragile. But war is often made of fragile chains. The Eastern Front was too vast and too violent for simple explanations. No single machine, no single commander, no single repair crew can carry the weight of what happened there. Millions of lives moved through that war. Many disappeared into it without names most of us will ever know. Still, small scenes matter because they let us see the larger truth more clearly. A hand on cold steel. A cable pulled through mud. A mechanic listening to an engine in darkness. A German gunner hearing movement where silence should have been. These details are not decoration. They are the texture of reality after belief has failed. The Germans were not foolish for thinking a knocked-out tank was a serious loss. It was. A hit tank meant fear, injury, death, wasted effort, broken plans. Many Soviet tanks did not return. Many crews burned with their machines. Many repair attempts failed. The Eastern Front was not a fable where resilience always wins. But enough returned to matter. Enough returned to disturb the confidence of men who believed destruction was final. Enough returned to make the enemy spend shells, time, attention, and nerve all over again. And enough returned to show that the Red Army's strength was not only in the tanks it built, but in the tanks it refused to abandon. There is a quiet lesson in that. War is often remembered through the clean lines of production charts and battle maps. How many tanks built? How many lost? How many divisions committed? How many kilometers gained? But between those numbers lies another history. The history of damaged things made useful. The history of men working in mud while generals slept near maps. The history of machines that should not have moved, moving anyway. Not because they were immortal, because someone made them move. Before dawn, the German crew saw the tank again. Perhaps they cursed. Perhaps they simply loaded the gun. Perhaps there was no time for surprise after the first few seconds. Training took over. Fear took over. Survival took over. That is how war works. Even astonishment has to make room for procedure. But somewhere inside that moment, a belief cracked. They had mocked Soviet field repairs as crude, desperate, temporary things. They had believed dead tanks stayed dead. But what really happened was that, on the Eastern Front, the dead were sometimes stripped, patched, dragged back, and given one more hour. And sometimes 1 hour was enough to change what happened next. The tank moved through the gray light with smoke behind it and infantry close in its shadow. Not perfect, not safe, not even fully alive in the way a machine should be, but real. And in war, reality is the only argument that survives. If you are watching from a place where World War II still lives in family memory, share where you are watching from in the comments. And if someone in your family served, repaired, carried, flew, sailed, nursed, or simply endured the war, you are welcome to leave their story below. Warfront Archive will continue following the forgotten details behind the battlefield. Not only what they believed, but what really happened.